Alrighty, hello class. So I am going to be doing a presentation today about culturally responsive teaching, and I'm just going to quickly go over most of my presentation is based off of the work of Zaretta Hammond. She created a very in-depth book about this form of teaching, why it's important, how it's different than the way we teach now, and a couple of ways to get started. So let's just jump right in. What is culture responsive teaching? The best way I feel to understand what culture responsive teaching is to kind of understand what we're doing now. What we're doing now is we're creating a completely different environment in the classroom than these children have ever been in, and this is especially affected to culturally diverse students. So the only real culture that the classroom hits now are cultures of, just generally white Americans in the classroom, where it should be more accustomed to everyone. And this is not that we're leaving anyone behind. We're actually just trying to include more people in the classroom. And that just comes from kind of getting more towards how you're taught at home, how you're taught things. You're taught from a really, if you look at this image here, welcoming and affirming environment. That basically sort of tries to relate back to, like, if your mother were to teach you something or your father were to teach you something, they would teach you in an environment where you believe that the other person is just genuinely trying to teach you something and not looking down on you or thinking less of you. Having high expectations, just encouraging your students to succeed rather than making them feel like that you in a way want to see them fail. Includes a curriculum and assessment, which basically just references to having resources that make other culturally diverse students feel welcome and feel like they're being represented in the curriculum. And then ongoing professional learning. This is more the expectation of the teachers to have an open mind while they're teaching students so that they can learn as well and figure out what they're doing wrong or where their shortcomings are in terms of their teaching environment. The next thing would be how does it differ from what I have now. I kind of went over that in the last slide. And for the previous slide, I just want to address that basically Zaretta Hammond in her book addresses how students have cultures that could be useful in the classroom. And this relates to this slide as well, of course, in that if students have been learning at home their entire life, it would be much easier for teachers. This is not necessarily asking teachers to do more, it's just giving them a better strategy. So it should be much easier for students to learn from an environment where they feel like they're coming from a place of that they're comfortable from rather than starting from fresh. So it's like, imagine if you were to start working in a restaurant and you have no idea how to make any of the food or anything like that, rather than starting out working in a restaurant where it's, food you've worked with before or something like that. It would clearly be easier to start in a restaurant where you know what's going on. You kind of have a baseline of knowledge where everything's coming from. She also states, and this is sort of a shocking fact, that by third grade, many culturally diverse students are 1 or more years behind in reading. And she says that this is just because that the way that reading is taught and the way that a lot of the basics are taught in the elementary school just comes from an angle that is only really digestible by the culturally standard students. And it's not necessarily putting malice on anyone's head, but we're just trying to address that this is something that is looked over in our classrooms, and today it could be much better and more inclusive for culturally diverse students. So the last thing and the most important thing is, how do you get started? So Zaretta Hammond, her main 3 tips to make any lesson culturally responsive are to gamify, and basically what that means is to kind of make a game out of anything you're doing, and it's not too hard. Just doing something like a Jeopardy or doing something like a matching game, to keep it as simple as possible, is much more susceptible for students because they're probably used to playing games at home and they're used to playing board games or anything like that. So any way you can relate to the way that they sort of engage their minds at home is the best way to, instead of gamify a lesson. Next would be to make it social, to allow students to collaborate, to work together, because they don't work on their own at home. So you can kind of see the trend here of just, if you can imagine a situation where a student is learning at home, being taught by their parents, and just figuring stuff out, you can imagine how that could be translated into the classroom. The last one, of course, would be to storify, telling a story to students. So rather than just telling them, if we were to do a history lesson, rather than just telling them what happened, sort of getting a letter recount, is rather than just telling people that the Gettysburg Address was spoken, just tell the speech and sort of build up the impact, kind of create a story out of it, as if they were listening to a podcast or something like that. These are her sort of guidelines for people to try to understand, but the general understanding is, if it's a way they know how to learn previously, use that. Don't give them a new way to learn in the classroom, because that's just starting from scratch, and you don't need to do that. All right. And that is going to conclude my speech today. This is the sources that I cited. All these sources basically just reference going over Zaretta Hammond, and this is a direct source from her. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for paying attention and watching the video.